For today's project, I'm building a bookshelf with an Art Deco pattern carved in the sides, and the coolest part, it has adjustable shelves. Once I got the design approved by the client, I made a print-to-scale pattern and used a little spray adhesive to attach it to a piece of plywood so I could turn it into a template. I didn't fuss around with trying to line up the drawing to the edge of the plywood. Instead, I just cut the plywood to the edge of the drawing. Then with a sharp razor blade, I traced around my drawing, leaving just the pattern. This is probably more of a psychological step, but in my mind all these years I've taught myself to leave the line when cutting out curves. So I used some spray paint to create a negative of the pattern. This way when I cut out the pattern I can leave the line and sand to it. Now that the paint's dry, I ripped off one side. The reason for this will become apparent later on. To cut the curves in the design I could have used a jigsaw, but that's a tool for a savage. So instead I plunged halfway through and free-handed it with a router. By only taking a shallow pass, the router is fairly easy to control going around curves. I chucked in a pattern bit with a bearing on it, and with a straight edge, I routed out the straight parts of the pattern. Then since I only took a shallow pass on the curved areas, I used that same bit and cleaned up the curves. Then did the final smoothing and shaping at the spindle sander. Now it's time to cut the other side. I pre-drilled a starter hole. Then used the same pattern bit to trace the template I had just made onto the other side. The bit is 3/4 of an inch in diameter. This will cut a groove to allow a 3/4 inch collar to ride in the groove, ensuring it doesn't wander away from the template. Speaking of wandering away from the template, I'll fix that in a minute. I took a second pass to cut the rest of the way through. Then used some blue tape to create a dam, mixed up some epoxy, and filled where I'd wandered away from the template. Then I smoothed out the epoxy and reshaped the curve with a rasp. Then finally, to cut the pattern out, I'm going to use this 3/4 inch collar with a V-groove bit and a router to ride the channel. But first I tested it, and any place it got hung up I smoothed it out with a rasp. Once I got the template made, it was time to mill up some lumber to build the side so I could put it to the test. Normally you see me use a biscuit or a domino to help keep the boards in line during glue up, but since I'm going to carve into these boards, I didn't want to risk carving through a misplaced domino. The riser blocks you saw me set up was to give a little extra room to get a clamp head under there, and the tape on the culls is to help keep them from being glued to the workpiece. Once the glue dried, I ripped it to its final width with the table saw and then cut it to its final length. And then headed back to the table saw to cut a dado to receive the back. Then I finally got to test out my template. I lined it up, clamped it down, chucked up a V-bit with a 3/4 inch collar, and routed out the pattern. Then I flipped it over, clamped it down, and routed out the pattern on the other side. Then I used some double stick tape and scraps of plywood to build up a little jig to route out the center pattern. That sound change in the router right at the end, well, that's the sound of it no longer cutting because the bit broke off. Luckily I only had about a 1/4 inch left to go, so I just finished it off old school style with a mallet and chisel. While I had the chisel in hand, I used it to clean up some of the fuzz left behind by the router. I changed up the router with a 1/2 inch guide bushing and a 1/4 inch plunge bit and plunged out the holes for the adjustable shelves. Now it's time to mill up the 8/4 stock for the top and bottom. Same procedure as always, except instead of using cauls for alignment, I was back to dominoes. The front of the bookshelf has a gentle curve to it. To create this, I plotted out the center and end points, ripped a thin flexible strip of scrap wood, drove some nails to act as pivot points, and drew in my curve. I pulled out the nails and headed over to the bandsaw to cut it out. I made sure I left the line so I could refine the curve and sand away the saw marks at the spindle sander. Now I used a template to trace the pattern on my workpiece, then roughed them out at the bandsaw. Instead of using the spindle sander to refine the edge, I double stick taped the workpiece to my template and used a pattern bit to make an exact copy. I needed to extend the dado for the back panel into the top and bottom pieces, so before heading to the router table, I made a relief cut with my chisel to prevent tear out on the ends. I set the height of the bit using a brass setup block, then I added stop blocks to the fin so I'd have a starting and stopping point. So of course the router left rounded corners, so I cleaned them up with a mallet and chisel. Alright, we're on the home stretch. I used floating tenons to attach the top and bottom. Since the joint is ingrained and long grain, it's not going to be very strong. So in addition to floating tenons, I used epoxy for the glue up. Epoxy is gap filling, so it soaks into the end grain and fills the gap between the two pieces, creating a strong enough joint for this bookcase. Once I got all the glue spread on both sides of the joints, I started assembling it. I discovered that this thing is tall and awkward and hard to put together, which is another benefit of using epoxy. It has a long working time before setting up. Before the glue was set, I did one final check to be sure it was square. The back is just a piece of 1/2-inch plywood I cut to fit on the table saw. Making the adjustable shelves were the same procedure as the top and bottom, except I added a filler strip to my jig to take into account the thickness of the sides of the case. After paint, the only thing left to do is to attach the safety straps for the customer to install on their end.